How does a leader project strength when even his own showcase looks hollow? That was the question hanging over Moscow as Vladimir Putin stood watching a drab Victory Day parade that barely looked like a parade at all. Before we go further, I'm John Lawrence, and this is my channel, John Lawrence. If you value serious reporting and clear geopolitical analysis, subscribe, share this video, and leave your view in the comments, because what happened around that parade tells a bigger story than any speech ever could. While Putin tried to present confidence, another humiliation was unfolding elsewhere. Ukraine was reclaiming what Russia had spent months trying to steal, and that contrast was brutal. Russia was supposed to be driving forward with force and momentum. Instead, Putin was left watching a muted display at home while the reality of his war kept exposing the weakness behind the image. The deeper embarrassment is not symbolic, it is military. Russia's grand offensive was meant to crush Ukrainian resistance and deliver visible gains. But by the assessment of the Institute for the Study of War, Russia has made no meaningful operational progress over the past year. That does not mean there has been no movement at all. Russian troops are still creeping forward in places, but the pace is painfully slow and the gains are strategically thin. Towns that should have fallen quickly have taken months or even years. Toretsk was seized only after a 14-month campaign. Seversk took 41 months. Pokrovsk fell after a 2-year effort. Each of those advances came with heavy Russian losses in men and equipment, and none of them produced a decisive breakthrough. That is not the mark of a powerful army. It is the mark of a force grinding itself down for scraps. Nowhere is that clearer than around the Donetsk fortress belt. Putin reportedly wants the Donbas taken by September. For that goal to mean anything, this fortified line has to break. Russia's spring and summer offensives were supposed to begin that process. Instead, they have barely scratched the surface. The only notable pressure has come near Kostiantynivka, where Russian infiltration units began probing as far back as October 2025. But those small groups have not opened the way for a larger assault. They have not unlocked momentum. They have not broken the line, and time is running. It is already mid-May. If Russia cannot do more than test the southern edge of the fortress belt now, the idea of taking the whole Donbas by September looks detached from reality. A stalemate is already visible, and the longer this goes on, the more Putin's promise starts to sound like fantasy rather than strategy. Then came the ceasefire spectacle. Putin appears to have believed that a temporary pause around Victory Day would give him a few hours of calm and help protect the image he wanted to project. But even that fell apart. According to the ISW, the overall tempo of operations did drop during the ceasefire period, yet fighting continued. Russia accused Ukraine of violating the pause 8,170 times, citing thousands of drone strikes, more than 1,000 artillery and rocket attacks, and a number of ground assaults. But Moscow had little moral space to make that case. Russia itself launched an air attack around the evening of May 8th using an Iskander-M missile and dozens of drones, and it remains unclear whether that strike ran into May 9th, so even the ceasefire became another self-inflicted embarrassment. Putin tried to frame himself as the victim of disorder, while Russia's own actions helped destroy the credibility of the pause. While Russia stumbled, Ukraine started shifting the battlefield in a more serious way. Back in December, as Russian forces were still straining to take Pokrovsk, Moscow claimed it had effectively secured Kupiansk in the north. That would have been an important advance. Instead, the claim collapsed. By mid-December, Ukraine launched a hard counterattack and liberated most of the area, undercutting Russia's narrative and exposing the weakness of its hold. More importantly, it showed that Ukraine's newer search and destroy methods were working against Russian infiltration tactics. That moment mattered because it signaled a larger shift. From there, the momentum began moving away from Russia. And when 2026 began, Ukraine did not simply defend. It went on the attack in the occupied south. The effect was immediate and deeply humiliating for Moscow. Russia was still trying to force costly movement in Donetsk, while Ukraine was proving it could retake ground elsewhere. During the winter and early spring of 2026, Ukraine reportedly liberated about 400 square kilometers of territory. Some of the latest gains came in western Zaporizhia in late April. That matters because while Russian troops were battering themselves against fixed defenses in Donetsk, Ukraine was achieving something Moscow had tried to deny for months. It was reversing the map. April 2026 became the first month since August 2024 in which Russia suffered a net territorial loss. Ukraine ended that month with a net gain of 116 square kilometers. And there was another problem for Putin. Kursk was supposed to be settled, it was supposed to be a closed chapter. Yet Ukraine's commander in chief, Oleksandr Syrsky, said Ukrainian forces were still operating there. So the picture is stark. Russia's gains are slow and costly. Ukraine is taking back land. And even areas Moscow claimed to have secured are still being contested. That is why the Victory Day parade looked so revealing. It was meant to display confidence, force, and control. Instead, it exposed shortage, caution, and insecurity. Putin spent 45 minutes watching one of the shortest parades Russia has staged in years, and the absence of military hardware was impossible to ignore. The threat of a Ukrainian strike was too serious. Much of the equipment that would normally be paraded is needed inside Ukraine where it risks destruction anyway. Attendance told its own story. Only 10 world leaders reportedly showed up, less than half the number seen the year before. Some of Russia's most powerful supposed partners stayed away. Xi Jinping did not appear, and no Chinese delegation was sent to soften that absence. To make matters worse, North Korean soldiers were paraded in Moscow. That was meant to symbolize support, but it also advertised dependence. The message was clear, though not the one Putin wanted. So, how did Russia end up here? One major reason is military communication failure. In early 2026, Russia lost access to illicit Starlink use after tighter controls reportedly ensured that only legitimate Ukrainian terminals would function. The impact was immediate. Russian communications along the front were thrown into confusion. Command posts struggled to reach units. Coordination weakened. Defensive reactions in the south began to falter. In the aftermath, some Russian commanders reportedly fell back on outdated maps that no longer reflected reality. Units were sent forward without proper synchronization. Then Putin made the problem worse. Around the same time, his domestic crackdown on Telegram removed another tool that many Russian troops had been using to pass information. That meant the battlefield was hit by two communication shocks at once. Orders became less clear. Real-time intelligence became harder to share. Ukraine saw the opening and pushed into the south with force. Those Ukrainian gains created another crisis for the Kremlin. Russia had spent months building reserves in Donetsk for its planned drive against the fortress belt. Those troops were supposed to support the offensive around Pokrovsk and then cycle forward for the next phase. But Ukraine's southern counterattacks changed the equation. Suddenly, Putin faced a choice he never wanted. Should reserves stay in the priority sectors and keep trying to force progress toward the September deadline, or should they be redirected south to slow Ukrainian advances and recover lost ground? Either choice carries a cost. If Russia keeps feeding the Donetsk front, Ukraine gains more space in the south and moves closer to threatening wider positions. If Russia shifts forces south, the already sluggish offensive in the east slows even more. That is what battlefield tempo looks like. Ukraine is setting the rhythm, Russia is reacting. And for Putin, that loss of control may be even more dangerous than the territorial losses. At the same time, Russian casualties are climbing to levels that are becoming harder to absorb. Ukraine says March 2026 brought around 35,000 Russian casualties, verified by drone operators. April reportedly produced a similar figure, with President Volodymyr Zelensky saying more than 35,000 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded. That puts Russia's daily casualty rate well above 1,000, and the consequences go beyond statistics. Russian assaults depend on pushing men forward, taking ground, and holding it long enough for reinforcement. But that model starts to collapse when the attacking force is being torn apart faster than it can stabilize. Ukrainian officials have said Russia is losing 316 soldiers for every square kilometer it gains in Donetsk. On May 9th alone, Russia reportedly lost 1,080 troops, along with artillery systems, armored vehicles, trucks, and fuel transport. These are not isolated spikes. They increasingly look like the normal cost of Russia's current approach. And that is where the pressure becomes cumulative. A truck destroyed on a rear road is not just a truck lost, it is ammunition that never arrives. It is fuel that never reaches armored units. It is food, spare parts, and medical support delayed at the exact moment frontline troops need them most. A damaged command post does not just slow one decision, it creates hesitation across an entire sector. Orders arrive late. Reinforcements move too slowly. Units already under pressure are left exposed for longer than planned. That is how offensives begin to stall without a dramatic collapse. They simply lose coherence one strike at a time. For Russia, the problem is that these effects are now happening at multiple levels at once. The near rear is under pressure from medium-range drone strikes. Oil sites and export infrastructure deep inside Russia are under pressure from long-range attacks. That means the battlefield is being squeezed both from the front and from the systems that sustain it. Even when Russian forces try to push, they are doing so with weaker logistics, more fragile communications, and growing uncertainty behind the lines. Ukraine is not just hitting targets, it is breaking the rhythm of Russia's war effort. And once that rhythm is broken, every new assault becomes harder to organize, harder to supply, and harder to survive. That is why the map is shifting. Not because Russia stopped attacking, but because Ukraine found a way to make those attacks increasingly ineffective. All of this leaves Putin facing a reality he tried to hide behind pageantry. His army was supposed to dominate. Instead, it is bleeding men, losing equipment, stalling in Donetsk, and giving ground in the south. The demand to take the Donbas by September now looks less like a plan and more like a public trap of Putin's own making. Even Ukrainian officials argue that only an enormous force could break the fortress belt, and the cost would be staggering. So the humiliation is no longer a passing moment. It is structural. It is visible in the battlefield map, in the casualty numbers, in the absent allies, and in that strangely hollow parade in Moscow. If you value this kind of serious analysis, subscribe to my channel, John Lawrence, share this video, and comment with your thoughts below. Because the deeper this war goes, the clearer one truth becomes. Putin may still refuse to see his failure, but history already might.